Hello and welcome to Devil's Advocate. The approach paper to the 11th five-year plan will be presented to the Prime Minister sometime later this month. Here to talk about its goals and the obstacles that must be overcome to achieve them is the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Dr. Ahluwalia, let me start with a simple question. Your approach paper is entitled Towards Faster and More Inclusive Growth. Is growth therefore the core target that has to be achieved, and are all the other objectives and goals only achievable once growth has been attained?
Well, growth is a key target, but it's not the only target. I mean, we don't plan to distinguish between the importance of growth and making it more inclusive.
Absolutely, but the other targets follow from the attainment of a particular target of growth.
They are helped by a higher growth rate, but I don't think they follow automatically. I think this is the important point.
Now, the growth rate that you've targeted for yourself could be said to be exceptionally high. You set a target of 8.5% as an average over the 5 years of the 11th five-year plan, and given the average that you've achieved over the last 5 years of roughly 7%, it means that you have to achieve 9.5% perhaps in your last year. Is that something that you can actually achieve, or is it just wishful thinking?
I have absolutely no doubt that you can achieve 9.5% if you do what is necessary. You know, the Indian economy has reached there. The question is, will we be able to take the supportive measures?
Well, you said something very interesting. If you do what is necessary, Shankaracharya, India's longest-serving chief economic advisor, says that sustained growth rates above 8% are possible, provided India tackles major economic reforms. Do you accept that?
Oh, it's absolutely right. I mean, that's exactly what we say. It's not going to happen automatically. We are on a very good wicket. I mean, the average growth rate, as you said, is over 7% now. But to get from that to 8.5 isn't just a matter of coasting along.
So you do accept that economic reforms, in fact, tackling and grappling with major economic reforms is absolutely essential to achieving your growth rates?
Yes, absolutely.
In which case, let's talk about your determination to achieve those particular economic reforms that most people believe are essential for your growth rates. Now, your growth rate of 8.5% assumes that India's overall investment rate will jump from 29.1% to 35.1%, 50 to 70% of which would be catered for by the private sector. And as your approach paper says, our policies must aim to create an environment in which entrepreneurship can flourish. And yet you don't establish a clear and definite position on the vital need for labor law reform. Why?
I think we do say clearly, by the way, that that's an important issue. But what we say is politically, we need to develop a consensus.
Well, in fact, you don't even say it's such an important issue. Let me quote to you exactly what you say on the subject. This is a sensitive issue. The central government should initiate a dialogue with labor leaders to evolve a consensus. There is scope for improvement without resorting to extreme measures. To many people, that sounds not like an advocacy of determined labor reform, but an attempt to duck the issue by speaking euphemistically.
I think that's not entirely fair. I mean, the government has made it very plain that this is not an issue on which it's going to do top-down decision-making. It needs to discuss with trade unions. It's also clearly ruled out hire and fire. The main point we're making is, short of hire and fire, there are a lot of things that can be done.
But you're talking of the government and the position the government has taken on the issue. I'm talking to the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, who supposedly has created an economic vision with a roadmap to get there. Why are you allowing yourself to be hobbled and constrained by political issues that governments worry about? You should set out a clear economic vision. You're not doing that.
I'm not sure that's a fair statement, actually.
Is it not?
Because I think, you know, economic policy is to some extent the art of what is politically feasible. I don't think there's much interest in defining positions which have no relation whatsoever.
Political feasibility is often determined by economic necessity and the fact that you don't have a choice but to act that way. Now, let me quote to you what you said in your midterm appraisal of the 10th five-year plan, which was issued only last year. There you said, labor flexibility is one of the serious problems. That seriousness has suddenly disappeared from your consideration now in your approach paper.
No, I think it may be that the particular sentence you're quoting doesn't contain that sense. But if you look at the
whole document doesn't contain that sense of urgency and seriousness. The document is riddled with euphemistic, sensitive language. You're behaving like a politician rather than an economist.
No, but we want to get political change. I mean, let's be clear. This is a sensitive issue. We're running a coalition government. The name of the game is making labor realize that labor reform is in their interests. we say quite clearly that if you want to emulate what the Chinese have done, if you want to expand employment in the organized sector, labor reform is something you should tackle.
I wish you'd said it half as clearly as you're saying it to me, because actually in the document you sound more like a politician. Are you suggesting to me that you have to deliberately use language that makes labor reform palatable to politicians to make it possible for them to accept it? And that's why you've toned down your language from your appraisal of the 10th five-year plan to your approach paper, which you're going to be issuing later this month.
Well, language is a matter of trying to persuade people. I mean, the language is not...
It's also a reflection of your determination and seriousness.
Yes, indeed, but what is our objective here? The objective here is to build a consensus.
But people who talk euphemistically end up building a consensus at the lowest possible level. You want it at the highest possible level.
Clearly, absolutely no question about that. But I think the document says, and it's only a draft, maybe we should clarify it. The document says...
Are you accept the need to clarify?
We are going through a major revision taking into account comments received.
So there's a good possibility that the euphemistic language which I am suggesting could be misleading will be toughened up. Will you put spine and steel into your language?
I'm sure you'll find the new document when it comes out will reflect a lot of inputs we've received from elsewhere.
Will your colleagues let you get tougher, or will your colleagues push you to become even more mild?
When you say colleagues, what do you mean?
Other members of the Planning Commission?
No, these are issues on which actually there are differences, and I'm glad there are differences. I mean, the point is, this is not an issue, unlike, say, for example, infrastructure development, on which virtually everybody agrees.
That's why toughness and clarity of language is essential. Now, will you be able, as Deputy Chairman, to ensure that the clarity that you want is actually reflected in the final document?
I think you'll have to wait and see what the final document says. But let me say that the object is, where there are differences, the differences reflect the fact that the public at large, there's not a kind of unanimous opinion.
You sound
the name of the game,
you sound like a politician. You ought to be in the cabinet rather than the Planning Commission.
Well, I mean, you know, I sit in the cabinet, so I'm not viewing...
You've been influenced by the politicians. Instead of a vision, you've got a political document. Let me bring up a second issue that many believe, in fact, is an equally important test of the sort of reforms you have to grapple with if you're going to achieve 8.5% overall growth. It's to do with making access to FDI easier in India. Now, on the critical issue of FDI in retail, you've ended up once again ducking the challenge. This is what your approach paper says. This is an area of policy where there are different views. We need to evolve a consensus, keeping in mind the balance of advantages and disadvantages. Why don't you clearly say that India has to open the retail door to FDI as China has done?
Well, you know, individuals again on this can have... My own view on this is there's merit in opening
what
it
does
up.
merit
Let me explain.
For it or against it, and how strongly for it are you?
Most important thing isn't whether it's FDI, and we are very clear about that. Modern retailing must be allowed to expand.
It will be getting a huge fillip if FDI comes in, and it will be done much faster if FDI comes in than if you have to rely on domestic retailers taking up that responsibility for you.
I think that's probably true.
Let me quote you once again what the appraisal of the 10th five-year plan issued last year said on this very subject. There is a strong case for allowing FDI in modern retailing. The fear of large adverse effects on domestic retailing appears to be grossly exaggerated. Where is that strong case in your approach paper? Instead, your fears are what have dominated your thinking.
Not at all. I think it's true that the approach paper reflects a somewhat weaker tone on the issue of FDI.
You concede that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a reflection of the fact that we don't perceive that there is sufficient consensus on this issue. But I do want to make a...
The problem is, if you're going to be determined by what you think is the existing political consensus, you'll never be strong in your language. However, were you to be strong and tough in your language, you might help create a tougher consensus.
I think
push rather than allow yourself to be pushed.
Ultimately, there's a difference between a midterm appraisal, which doesn't have to be a basis for approval for policy of the next 5 years, and an approach document which actually has to be
So Montek,
approved.
the politician, has once again won over Montek, the economist.
No. I think the issue is very loud and clear. Let me say, I do believe, by the way, given the stage of the development of retail, the introduction of modern retailing is very crucial and overdue.
And that will happen most effectively and most swiftly if you permit FDI to come in. It'll happen much more slowly and perhaps more inefficiently if you rely on Indian domestic companies to take up that responsibility.
Yeah, the argument for letting in FDI for retail is the same as in any other sector.
But you don't make it as strongly as you can.
No,
you
no, but let me put it this way. In other sectors too, we're doing this. We have done it in the past in a graduated fashion.
Let me put it like this. When the final version of your approach paper comes out later this month, just as you suggested you might toughen up your language on the whole question of labor law reform, will you similarly toughen up your language on FDI and retail?
Well, the intention is to clarify wherever people think there's lack of clarity.
All right, I'll take clarification for toughening, because I'm saying to you that in your lack of clarity is weakness.
But I want to emphasize one thing. FDI in retail is not, in my view, critical in the next few years to achieve 8.5%
Others
growth.
would disagree.
Many other things are much more critical.
Sure, but I point out to you that other economists who share your desire for 8 or 9% growth would disagree. They would say that FDI in retail would be a clear symbol of the government's determination to do everything it can to overcome obstacles.
Oh, there's no doubt that people would view it as a symbol. But there are a lot of other symbols that are much more important. In my view, doing something on infrastructure over anything else is the single most important thing to do.
To be able to do something on infrastructure, in fact, the government has to actually raise the resources to do so. You say clearly that a third major challenge that the government faces in tackling the issue of 8.5% reform is this whole question of fiscal discipline. Let me quote to you what in fact your paper says. In practice, this means control of subsidies and also levy of rational user charges. Now, why don't you say boldly and upfront that India has to cut subsidies and it has to stop all free power?
Well, it certainly has to cut or at least control subsidies, which is the same thing. I don't think, by the way, that it has to stop all free power. If you had a government giving free power to some particular segment which was small enough and deserved subsidy, I would not have any objection.
A particular segment small enough on which deserves subsidy, 3 conditions. Why don't you stipulate those 3 conditions? That itself would tell people that you're serious about rational user charges. Otherwise, rational user charges is a euphemism for sliding over the problem, not addressing it.
No, I think if you look at the section on power, and generally on electricity, and this is, by the way, an area where we've received a lot of feedback, and I agree with you that we should be much clearer.
You agree you need to be clearer?
Wherever there's lack of clarity, we should be clearer. I believe that this is an issue where people are willing to look at it and maybe take a decision in the next couple of years.
All right, in that very frame of mind, let me then address one other issue. Your approach paper says that, in fact, government savings have to increase by 3.5% from a present position of roughly minus 1.1 to plus 2.4. And yet, nowhere in your approach paper do you talk about disinvestment or privatization. Does that make sense?
Well, I don't think disinvestment is not the same thing as government savings. I mean, the two are quite different. I mean, you're just...
Well, if we're not going to be able to increase government savings by cutting substantially on subsidies and cutting off all free power, then you're going to have to use privatization as a way of raising those resources.
No, but the major subsidies are not the ones that go to
and let me point out something else. When it comes to symbols of economic reform the world over, from Mrs. Thatcher's time in the 80s onwards, the government's ability to tackle privatization is a symbol of its determination to tackle reform. It's a symbol of its determination to concentrate on issues that it does best. And it's an invitation to foreign investment to come in. That's why privatization is important.
But you see, get away from symbols. I agree with you that these things are regarded as symbols. But I think we are past the stage where we have to rely on symbols. There are some real issues we have to address. As far as foreign direct investment is concerned, in my view, people are not looking for symbols. People are looking for real progress on infrastructure.
What people are looking for when they look at your approach paper is for a coherent approach that actually delivers the growth you need. Let me give you an example why they're disappointed. Your paper says there is a strong case for denationalizing coal. Admittedly, I agree with you, there probably is. There's also a strong case for denationalizing Air India and an equally strong case for privatizing Indian Airlines and the Ashoka Hotel, but you don't address those. Why?
No, hang on. Denationalizing coal is very different from privatizing an individual
But it's
unit.
equivalent to denationalizing Air India.
No, because coal, the whole of the coal sector is nationalized. So what we're really saying is, we're not necessarily
Air
saying...
India has been making losses, except for the last few years, pretty pathetically. It's a company that was considered a star airline when it was run by the Tatas, and in the early years of government ownership. Today, it's almost an apology for an international airline. Surely there's a case for tackling it.
Well, my point is that we're concerned about the sector. The Indian civil aviation sector is doing exceptionally well. Yes, you can look at Air India's problems. in the coal area, since we've nationalized the whole sector, our concern is let private sector coal mining
But it
come
wasn't
in.
actually coal that I was talking about so much as making an example of coal to say that what you need is a coherent, rational policy that approaches the need for reforms in a fundamental way rather than ad hoc piecemeal responses. That's why people
But
feel
Karan,
you've set a high target, but you
No.
haven't overcome the obstacles.
Let me challenge you. I mean, you're over-impressed by the things that people regard as symbols. It's true that if you disinvest or privatize a particular public sector unit, a hotel here,
I'm
or a hotel
impressed by
there,
symbols because
It's not important.
because they're the only indication of your determination to achieve reform, to secure the target you want. Otherwise, that target of 8.5% looks like wishful thinking.
No, but you see, the fact that Mumbai and Delhi airport are being modernized with a
What
substantial...
about the fact that Calcutta and Chennai won't be modernized the same way?
Well, that's not yet a decision. That's
It's almost
the next
certainly
stage
so
that
because
has to be done.
Prakash Karat is tom-tomming the fact
No,
to
let us,
everyone.
let's, in the civil aviation sector, you've got real progress.
All right, let's accept that. Let's pause for a moment and take a break, and let's come back and talk about the real big challenge, which I've left to the last, the challenge of agriculture. Are you tackling it with the determination it needs, or will that be the obstacle that your approach paper will trip over? We'll be back in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to an exclusive interview with the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Dr. Ahluwalia, let's turn to what many consider to be the single biggest hurdle to achieving 8.5% growth, agriculture. Your approach paper sets a target of 4% agriculture growth. It's the same target that was set in the 10th plan and it wasn't achieved there. How can you be sure you're going to achieve it this time around?
Because we are arguing that we shouldn't go for business as usual. We need to rework the whole agricultural strategy. And that's what
Just for a moment, I want to actually talk to you about what you mean about not going for business as usual. But first, let me point out that in fact this time around achieving 4% growth is even more difficult than it was earlier, because now you're doing it from an average of 1.5% over the last 5 years, which means that agriculture has to improve by over 100%. And you haven't sketched out a detailed or even a coherent strategy for achieving this growth.
Well, you know, the approach document isn't meant to spell out the details. That'll come in the
But
plan.
then how do you say you're not going for business as usual? Because to everyone else, as you read it, your approach document sounds just like business as usual.
Oh, no. I think we are making... let me mention 2 or 3 things. First, irrigation. We're recognizing that not enough has been done. You're going to have to do more in terms of putting money into irrigation. Second, about 60% of the land area is not in the irrigation setup. It's really rain-fed irrigation. You need a completely different approach to moisture conservation.
Third,
And third is that you've got to recognize that, you know, we're moving away from the 1 or 2 crop area to diversified agriculture.
and these you believe are the 3 principal thrusts in agriculture that can deliver 4% growth.
If you force me to say 3, actually I could give you 7 or 8.
Well,
a
let me
lot of
tell you
them.
why I sound skeptical in putting that question. Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, the chairman of the National Commission of Farmers, has actually spoken to me and said that he doesn't believe your approach paper has anything like a coherent or even a fledgling strategy for achieving 4% growth. And he says in the absence of that strategy, this is just wishful thinking. And I can add that even eminent wives of members of your own planning commission like Jayati Ghosh have written to say that the plan projections blithely assume that GDP in agriculture will grow much faster, yet suggests no way to ensure this.
I think this is simply a desire to see the plan itself when you're reading the approach. I mean, a 90-page document is not going to have details. But I do think that the document
But
does
should it not have
indicate-
enough to convince people like Dr. M.S. Swaminathan?
Well, that's not what Swaminathan said to us, by the way, and we certainly have been in touch with Swaminathan. He himself has produced a huge strategy in the National Farmers Commission.
Quite
which
right.
we're
In
taking
fact,
into
he's
account.
highlighted 5 particular things. I won't bore you by repeating them, but he also says that none of the 5 points that he's highlighted for tackling the crisis in agriculture have found adequate reflection in your approach paper.
Well,
He's disappointed.
This is the agriculture area of the approach is the one that we've had the maximum amount of discussion with people. And I think that in the revised version, you'll see a lot of changes. It still won't achieve the objective of having the whole strategy, but hopefully it will address some of these, a little bit of the empty spots might get filled in a little bit more.
Let me put it like this. If your critics turn out to be right and agriculture fails to grow by anything like 4%, will you then accept that in those circumstances your target of an average of 8.5% growth over the next 5 years is unachievable?
Actually, the role of agriculture is less its impact on the growth rate than its impact on inclusiveness.
So you're confident that even if agriculture stays in the doldrums of 1.5 to 2%, you might still achieve 8.5% average growth over 5 years?
No, my guess is that the direct contribution of failing to do 4% in terms of loss of growth would be something over half a percentage point. The indirect contribution, because the lack of dynamism will affect others, could be about 1 percentage point.
So in fact, you won't achieve your target if agriculture doesn't achieve its target?
Unless something else were to offset it. But that's not good enough, because then you won't have equity.
With the last question that in a sense tries to take an overview of our entire discussion. People listening to this discussion, aware of the very high ambitious target that you set, will say that Montek Ahluwalia thinks big, plans small, and therefore when it comes to action he can only take minute steps that won't really take him very far at all.
Well, I think I'm hoping that when A, the approach, but more importantly the plan document comes out, people will be reassured that we're not just sort of taking small steps, we're taking a lot of big steps.
So the clarity that I'm saying is absent will be there.
Well, I'm not conceding the clarity is absent, but I think you'll find a better document when you read it next time around.
A better document when we read it next time.
Hopefully.
Dr. Ahluwalia, a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks.
Devil's Advocate.
Bye-bye.